The story of the Irish economy is decades, maybe even centuries of underachievement, punctuated recently by a surprise, as a small economy has hitched itself to the coattails of globalization. We pushed ourselves to the top of the league of global economies, and we convinced ourselves and other people that we had an economic model worth following. I'll give you a bit of history to illustrate that. If I take a good run at history and go back to the year 1500, and look at the GDP per capita of Ireland compared to that of the UK, you'll see for a very, very long time, maybe four and a bit centuries, the ratio of Irish GDP to British was about half. And there's plenty of good and bad reasons for that, which I won't go into today. But around about 25 years ago, something changed. We got our finances in order. We discovered an economic model based on bringing in multinationals to Ireland, building some of our own businesses, and I think for some time we became the envy of the world. Ultimately, I think we've failed what I would call the global question. And the global question, I think, is how do small countries survive in an intensely globalized world? How do they offset many of the effects that come from outside, things like low interest rates? So I think in the last 2 or 3 years we have perhaps failed from a strategic point of view the global question, but I think now we have a crucial second chance, not just the Republic, not just the UK, but very much the whole island economy. Because I think this is potentially the most critical moment in our history since the 1920s, in terms of the potential outcomes that present themselves to us. We can either go back to the long-term history of underachievement, or we can rejoin the global recovery on a much more meaningful and authentic basis. I think also globally, the credit crisis is probably gives us the first flavor for what the world economy is going to be like through the rest of this century. And we need to pay very, very close attention to this. And the slide here, which looks at the percentage of world GDP made up of the major regions right through history, go back to 1820, when the Irish population was the same as Brazil. America wasn't even an emerging market, wasn't even a frontier market. China and India then were the global economic powerhouses. And that's the way it's going to go in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And I think Linda has detailed that very, very well. In terms of my own job in talking about markets and economies, I reckon the world economy is going to grow by about 4% in the next 12 months. And at least half of that will be made up by the emerging markets. And I can tell you, having had a volcano-enforced stay in Asia over the last couple of weeks, those economies are absolutely zipping along, be it Hong Kong, Singapore, etc. I think if we look at Europe, Europe really is going to be the odd man out. I think looking into the future, the US, because of many of the things Will has mentioned, technology, manufacturing base, should remain a significant player. But I think Europe is interesting for some of or rather for the many tensions that are going to face Europe. When people talk about the US and the Chinese economies, they use the word decoupling. But I think decoupling is much, much more important in the European context. Because if you look at the chart here, and the chart it's what economists call a purchasing manager's index. And it's quite a good lead indicator typically of economic activity. You see Germany is beginning to push ahead. Germany is benefiting from Greece's woes. You've got a weak euro, which helps German exporters. But interestingly, the indebted economies of Europe, Ireland, Spain, and in particular Greece, are really beginning to lag behind. And I refer to this as kind of driving with the handbrake on. It's very difficult to grow an economy if you've got lots of debt, high interest rates, policy volatility, etc., etc. No surprise also that the countries that are beginning to lag behind are those that have been at the epicenter of the credit crisis. People talk about the US housing market, the UK housing market being stretched. But if you look at a number of ratios, look at things like house prices to income, which is the chart I've got here. If you thought the UK and the US were bad, if you go back to the peak of the credit crisis, Ireland and Spain were extremely stretched. And what's happening now is that all of the debt that was built up by banks and by households to fuel this boom is now being taken on to the national balance sheet in Ireland. And in many respects, having gone from being one of the most admired economies in the early part of the last decade, Ireland is now, I think, economists' favourite case of a classic asset price bubble. And I think when people like Barry Eichengreen are writing up the history or updating the history of asset price bubbles, he will add Ireland to the pantheon of asset price bubbles going back to the Dutch tulip scheme. And if not, he most definitely should. Asset price bubbles are not financial affairs. They're very human affairs, involve a lot of greed, a lot of hubris. The great transformation of the Irish economy in the last 20 years occurred, unsurprisingly, hand in hand with an enormous social and political transformation. And we've seen so many different trends in consumption, materialism, the role of women in Ireland, the role of the church in particular. The best quote I could find to describe what's happened in Ireland maybe in the last 10 years was one that says, "The new rich were serving soup in a church offertory basin, sugar being dispensed from an incense burner, and salt from chalices." And you could imagine that was a caricature of what's happened in our own country in the last 5 or 10 years, but it's actually a quote from 1720 in France during the Mississippi scheme, which again, perhaps like Ireland, is up there in the pantheon of great asset price bubbles, when a Scotsman called John Law effectively blew up the French economy. And the point I would make here is that these things are universal. They occur through time. We've had the dot-com bubble, the emerging market bubble not so long ago. And we ourselves have become caught up in this. You might think also that for a banker, it's surprising I talk about Marx and Engels. I'm a big fan of Marx, and I think we have just, in the last 4 years, seen an incredible Marxian moment in terms of the collision of governments and markets and states. And Marx and Engels were great fans of Ireland. They wrote a great deal about Ireland. Engels himself toured Ireland twice, and he's got a lot of very wise things to say about Ireland. And I think something he said about 160 years ago still makes sense today. And to a large extent, and you look at the Irish media today, be it the radio, be it the newspapers, we have done a lot of things wrong, and we have got carried away. I'll give you a couple of examples of this. One of the most interesting bubble indicators is the growth in the number of golf clubs in Ireland. It's taken on additional significance recently because Anglo-Irish Bank, one of our sort of favourite bubble candidates, was found to have been stockpiling about 300,000 golf balls. But it's a good example of how a country perhaps has sold its soul, become over-gentrified, and got carried away with what ultimately was a false economic boom. And if we look at other, maybe more serious indicators, again, if you look at all the big stock market dislocations through histories, all the big bear markets, each of them has a particular country that stands out as being the totem or the example of each of those bear markets. World War II, there wasn't a big crash in global markets, but the country that lost that war did very badly. In the tech crash, Germany, with a whole load of technology companies, was the worst performing equity market. And in the recent global bear market, the credit crisis, the worst performing developed stock market was Ireland. So in a way, we are an economist's delight, because we have gone from being the most admired, the most desired country to being perhaps the basket case or the case study for the asset price bubble. Again, if you look at what happened to other key parts of our economy, if you look at banking crisis in the last 10 or 20 years, and look at the change in the price of the stock price of banking industries across a range of countries, Russia in the late 90s, Finland, the Scandi countries, South Korea, well, we've beaten them all. Our banking sector, in terms of share price or equity, has contracted by more than any of these. So we really are standing out very, very sorely in terms of the I suppose the dislocation or collapse in our economy, and this is really infusing a lot of the media debate. The reality, if you look at a lot of the academic work, be it from the IMF, suggests that these housing bubbles, when they crash, that collapse tends to persist for a couple of years. So the reality for our island, if you like, is that we have a few more years of deflation and hardship, and I think politicians should be upfront with that and should give people a narrative and if you like, a sort of a national strategy or vision to help us to get out of that. I think one of the things that has changed in Ireland compared, for example, to when I grew up, is that there is still a residue of confidence. And be it in the pages of the Irish Times or the Irish Economy blog, for example, there is a fervent debate on the recovery and what the recovery might look like going forward. And I think this conference, and the title of this conference, is another very, very important step in that. There's also a cottage industry of people now writing on the Irish economy, most of them writing about what went wrong and less about what went right or what might go right. And I don't want to contribute to that cottage industry in terms of scribbling down my own opinion and adding it to the pile. But I do know that Irish people are very sensitive to what people outside, people in Europe, the States, China, think of us, and what they make of our economic miracle and now our economic collapse. So together with a friend, Rory Miller, we've sought the advice of 12 economists, policymakers, politicians, including Alex Salmond in Scotland, Jonathan Powell, Blair's former chief of staff, who had a key role in the peace process here, and then economists in Vietnam, Singapore, Greece, Portugal, France, and the US. And we've asked them to reflect, if you like, to give a second impartial opinion on what we in Ireland have done right in the last 20 years. And they've all told us that you screwed up in terms of being a classic asset price bubble. But the one thing that was interesting is that there was a very, very strong consensus. And I think if I had asked Will Hutton to contribute, he would have agreed to this as well, because the one thing people identified as being maybe unique in terms of driving the Irish boom is what I call intangible infrastructure. So it's not the roads, the railways, etc., which are still in pretty poor condition in this island by comparison to France or China or Hong Kong. But things like the rule of law, a very good and open business climate, public goods like education, and this really taps a very, very rich vein through economic theory, going back from Gary Becker in California, right back to the likes of Adam Smith, who talks about things like peace, easy taxes, a tolerable administration of justice. So I think if we've done something right, intangible infrastructure is that. To some extent, I think we've lost touch with some of these things. If you look at attainment rates for education in Ireland, math, that's beginning to slip. I think the quality of a lot of our institutions, again, is beginning to slip as well. The other thing I think I would point out, again, I think there is a residue of confidence and a sense of perspective on the part of Irish business people, some policymakers that simply wasn't there maybe 20, 25 years ago. And I think as well a strong desire not to be Greece, not to be Portugal, and perhaps not to be Spain, not to have someone come from outside and help us off our feet, but to try and do it again ourselves. And in this respect and in many others, you could say that the economies, even the societies of the UK and Ireland, have never had more in common. I wish they had more positive things in common, but they have in common the struggle or the challenge of government indebtedness. Only Ireland and Greece are ahead of the UK in terms of the league table of most burdened developed nations in terms of fiscal deficit. They both manifestly need to move from consumption-based and borrowing-based economies to investment ones. I think they've both got to figure out where Europe is going. Do Germany and France want a core Eurozone? Is Europe serious about being competitive with Asia and with the States? If you look, for example, at some of the latest proposals on hedge fund and financial regulation, and they both need to reform. I'll give you just a couple of quick examples. This is quite striking. If you look at the IMF forecasts for debt to GDP for the advanced world, of which we are all part, it's going to hit about 100% in the next 3 or 4 years. The emerging world debt rates to GDP are falling. So this is a very, very significant challenge facing not just Greece in the headlines, but also Ireland and the UK. In terms of fiscal deficits, if I give you a sense as to how long these things take to cure, if you look at the worst fiscal crisis in the world, maybe the last 20 or so years, the Scandi countries during the 90s topping the list, some of the emerging markets, Turkey, Hungary, Argentina, always it seems having a financial crisis. I mean, on average, it will take 4 or 5 years to bring government finances, I would say in Ireland and most likely in the UK, back to sustainable, back to normal levels. In the South, government forecast getting the deficit back to 2% by 2014. So it really is a very, very big and significant task. I think one of the, perhaps politically, one of the good things in Ireland in terms of breaking the ice and getting the debate on the deficit enlivened was the McCarthy report. And looking at the news last night and seeing this IFS report come out and really stir up the general election debate, I think that IFS report could be the McCarthy report for the UK. Because I get, living in the UK, I get very little sense that people are facing up to the need to aggressively cut spending. And I think when that happens, it's going to have a significant implication for Northern Ireland. Historically, if you look at this chart, as the economy in the UK has recovered and unemployment begun to improve, historically, private sector employment has really taken over and public sector employment has begun to take a back seat. That's maybe a bit more questionable this time around in terms of if you look at the manufacturing and service base in the UK and a shrunken financial services sector. And it has very, very big implications for Northern Ireland. And the key reason for this is that in previous financial crises, governments could roll over debt. They could sort of put the problem aside and kind of ignore it. But as we're seeing today with Greece, we're now facing a reckoning. Bond markets are going to make countries clean up their finances. So big changes in fiscal policy are going to be forced on us. And if I look at Northern Ireland, and if I look across the UK regional economies, and you look at the percentage of public sector employment as a percentage of the total, Northern Ireland really stands out, even by comparison to Wales, Scotland, the Northwest, etc., etc. And also, I think if you look at the extent to which private business here is perhaps exposed to the state in terms of revenues, the impact is potentially greater. And I think this is perhaps an area where Intertrade Ireland, amongst other bodies, needs to get involved in terms of idea generation, because the economic, social and political costs of having sharply rising unemployment could be very, very severe. And I get a sense that it's something that people are really not quite prepared for. And I think at very least, in terms of painting a way forward, I think politicians on the ground, instead of simply saying, look, we're skint, we have to cut back spending, I think it is beholden upon them to have some kind of meaningful and credible vision that people can believe in and begin to take some kind of sacrifice in return for a better future. But unfortunately, I don't see any of that north or south of the border. So as potential remedies along that line, I think one of the things that draws the economy of the Republic, the North, and maybe the UK together is that this time it's not simply going to be about a cyclical recovery. There's got to be some really big structural changes. In particular, in the Republic, I think we need more strategy and less tactics, more technocrats. In general, the civil service in Ireland have not been well prepared for the credit crisis. And in general, I think they're not prepared for some of the challenges that are going to be faced ahead in terms of the skill set. Some people talk about new bodies like a Council for Economic Advisors. I would stretch that to a Council for Strategic Advisors, because small open countries like Ireland are not simply facing economic challenges, but a whole range of challenges. And I think if Ireland is serious about staying in the Eurozone, it needs to put in place some kind of body that will, if you like, intermediate the effect of interest rates being set in Frankfurt on our economy. For much of the last 10 years, interest rates in Ireland have been far, far too low. And there really should have been some kind of offsetting mechanism. So we need, if you like, to build new kind of institutions to fit the economic environment in which we're operating. Many of our institutions need to be re-engineered. Some of them very, very prominently in terms of things like regulation. Personally, I'm not sure who's going to do this, because there's a very general reluctance on the part of politicians to do this, but I think this is very, very important. The third point here is le grand méchant marché, what the French would call the big evil market. And we need to figure out where we stand in terms of capitalism and what our ethos is. And personally, I'm maybe sick of is the wrong word, but so many Irish entrepreneurs who I think were, calling themselves entrepreneurs, perhaps speculators in drag, if you like, were very happy to proclaim themselves as being the most aggressive capitalists on the way up. But like some of the bankers, when things got bad, they went running to the state. So we've got to be very, very clear as to the economic model we want in Ireland and how that affects our society. And we've got to be very clear about the risks of that as well. And then as a final point, we've got to be clear about where we stand in the world. People talk about Boston or Berlin. There are other options, Beijing, perhaps. Do we begin to look east? Or do we content ourselves, and this is no slight on Birmingham, I should say, do we content ourselves on this island with being just another kind of small regional economy within the UK? So I think clarity of ambition and strategy are really at a premium at the moment. I would say in drafting these slides, I think if you look at the interplays and the potential interconnections between the economy of the North, the South, the UK, there really is a strong role for bodies like Intertrade Ireland to play here, not just in bringing people together, but bringing out new ideas to face new challenges and really pushing those to the public forefront. And on that basis, I'm delighted to have been invited here to talk to you. Thank you.